jetzt sind wir live. Tut uns leid, kurze Unterbrechung, aber jetzt geht's los mit Smuggler. Ich übergebe direkt. Freue mich auf den Talk, Smuggler.
Okay. So, erstmal herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Ich hoffe, es ist okay, wenn ich auf Englisch wechsle, weil scheinbar habe ich ganz viele neue Freunde, die jetzt 1E9-Member wurden. Deswegen auf Englisch, wenn das für euch okay ist. Okay. So I was asked to talk about the future visions that I have as a crypto-anarchist in cypherpunk. And usually that will be a very welcome topic to speak about, but I think that it is more important for me right now to talk a little bit about how I think about the future, not just what visions I have for the future. And I think that we have to take a step back and look at what future really means. And there's this quote from William Gibson that says the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And one of the things that I think is really important to realize is that future is not a space, not a place, not an age that we're moving towards, but future is an ongoing process of change that we're already in. And there are three ways we can deal with that process. And one is that we just ignore it and see what happens. One is to watch it and try to adapt to what other people are doing with that process. And the third option is to shape that process ourselves and make it our own and to take control, because somebody always takes control. And when it comes to the future process or the process of future, there are three key human elements that we can control about that. And that is ideas that shape our activities and perceptions and expectations, and we can create them and disseminate them. Then there's the accumulation of power, and power is what allows us to maximize the effectiveness of our own decisions and our own plans. And then there's technology, and this conference is a lot about technology and the future of technology. So technology is maximizing the efficiency of our own activities. And there have been a lot of talks today about biotechnology and artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these things. And there's one technology that we often forget about. And it's a fundamental one that drives human experience, human condition, and the future itself, and that is management technology. It's so little viewed at that we often overlooked at it as a technology at all. Management technology is what deals with the question of governance, of how to deploy resources, how to deal with groups of humans, how to make rules, how to find rules. It deals with the acquisition of and distribution of resources, human or otherwise. It deals with conflict resolution, and it is actually at the core of what the digital age is about. Because let's remind ourselves that computers were created as information processing tools, primarily to help us in governments and in management. And the interesting thing there is that with the introduction of the computer, something happened. So before we had the computers, rules applied only to relationships of humans to each other, because humans were the only information processors. And then with computers, there's something that changes, because now suddenly rules apply to humans and they apply to digital systems. And the relationship between digital systems, between humans and between digital systems and humans. And with the introduction of physical systems, that is systems that are computer controlled but have a physical element, that have actors that control something in the physical world, now we have an application of those rules into the physical substrate through those cyber-physical machines. And what really happens is now that rules have transformed from being purely social to being cyber-social and to be cyber-socio-physical, maybe is the word. And that is a huge change that, even though we're in the information age for several decades now, has really not reached everybody. Because what happens with that is that our substrate of activity changes, and that is, before the development of more modern societies, or actually classical societies, we only have the social substrate, that is gestures, that is ideas, that is memory, and that is time, that is how we deal with other people. And then with the introduction of the modern state, we have things like atoms and space. We have the physical substrate in which we are active and in which we invest. But with cybernetic systems, we get bits and algorithms that become a substrate of our activity as well. And all these three things, the social substrate, the physical, and the cybernetic, are coupling together in one molecule, in one inseparable thing in which we have to act. And that means that data is not the new oil. Data is not something that is just out there and it's just something that we use in our future, but we have to really think about the fact that data is actually territory. And that is where the crypto-anarchistic thought slowly seeps in. Data is territory, and privacy and data sovereignty are questions of who controls our substrate of activity. And privacy is the question of, do we have ownership of our own personal space of activity where we can make decisions? So in a way, data sovereignty corresponds to the ability to create, implement, and enforce rules. And the loss of privacy destroys our personal domain, and the loss of data sovereignty destroys our governance ability, our ability to have social structures that survive. Now, the interesting thing is, and I promise there is some vision coming, is that we are currently facing not just this revolution of that our substrate of activity is dramatically changing. It's also that we haven't really understood that in the way we manage systems and societies. So what we're experiencing right now in our current modes of governance is that we have something like a complexity wave rolling over us. Maybe you have experienced that yourself when you have to deal with laws, regulations, or just have a loan application, or maybe even registering a phone. It is something where we realize that our knowledge horizon is withdrawing far more into the background. And a lot of people today are already at that brink where they cannot manage the fundamental contracts and decisions of their life anymore. And the reason for that is that we have built systems that cannot deal with complexity at all. So today, the progress in management technology and governance is about adding new rules. It's about adding more depths, more widths, but there's no simplification, there's no locality. We're building more and more universal systems. And that is a problem, because increased complexity and coupling of systems increases the systemic risk and creates uncontainable failure modes. And uncontainable failure modes combined with something else, that is systemic tension, leads to existential risks. And systemic tension is something that we can see because of the lack of locality that the internet and digitalization have brought us. It's the increase of politicization, it's the increase of polarization, it is nepotism, it is corruption, and so many people that try to control our information systems to create a path lock-in. This is a problem, and it is a problem that, if it comes to fruition, might become terrible, because if we're unable to govern our societies, we're actually going to fail in all the other nice technologies we're talking about, be it bio or being it hydrogen power or anything else that we all really like and are interested in. But if you're not able to manage our societies, our groups, our rules, then all these things are going to be turned against us. We should turn around and take a few lessons from people that actually deal with complexity. And one of those groups are software engineers, because software is one of the most complex things you can do these days. It's one of the most complex tools that we build is software. We have billions of lines of codes that interact with each other. So we have to learn how to deal with these rules. And software engineers do that. So we're talking about things like modularization, decoupling, containment, reusability, simplification. So why am I, as a crypto-anarchist, talking about that? I'll explain that. Crypto-anarchy is a body of thought that deals with the interplay of power and technology. It deals with the nature of information and how it changes our world. And crypto-anarchy 30 years ago realized that data is not oil, data is territory, and that we have to protect it with cryptography. It realized that governance complexity is a fundamental threat, maybe even to the survival of our societies or beyond, and that we have to reinforce locality and enforce this with access control. And it also realized that the future is going to be faster and faster when it comes to change. And that means that we have to build parallel systems that allow us to adapt and contain risks. So what does that really mean? We have to rethink how, in an information age, we are making concepts and rules about how we deal with data. And because data is now everything, we have to rethink the rules and methods in how society works. One of these rules, and that is part of my vision for the future, is that we have to realize that data needs to be controlled by its subject. It has to be gathered by the subject, and it has to be stored and shared by the subject. That means we're using cryptography, for example, for realizing deniability and anonymization so that data can still be shared without being used against us. The second thing is that we have to re-envision and upgrade how we're talking about identity. Identity in the legal sense primarily, and there's a big change coming, because so far we considered identity to be a product of social assignment. Somebody else says who we are. That is what you have a passport for. But in the future, it might be much better to have identity by being. And I'm not talking about biometrics, but I'm talking about knowledge. It's the ability to prove who you are by you knowing a secret. That is what cryptography is actually about. And that means that with the introduction of zero knowledge proofs, we can actually show to other people who we are without the risk of identity theft, without the risk of somebody impersonating us, and without the risk of somebody just revoking our identity. And then that has an impact on how we deal with the physical world and the rules between us. So, for example, titles to ownership, to goods, to houses, to cars, etc. In the past, they were a piece of paper in a social structure. Currently, what is happening already with blockchain technology and similar things is that titles become immutable successions of agreements between identities. There's only two parties involved in a transaction, and the rule complexity is dramatically reduced. And that also means that our cyber-physical interactions become rooted in these titles. So today you can already transfer access to cars via the blockchain, so you can open them. Basically, you own the car as long as you can open it. And then there's the question of how do we actually adapt and minimize risks, especially when it comes to creating rules and laws. And that is the coexistence of people in multiple societies and governance structures. We're so used that we're citizens of only one state or employees of only one company. But technology allows us and forces us to rethink that and to leave the accidents of birth and place and instead cooperate with those people with whom cooperation is the most fruitful. And lastly, we have to relearn extreme localization. We have to make sure that our decisions are not harming too many other people. We have to learn how to deal with complexity in new ways by becoming more innovative and more experimental, but also by having strict borders towards those people that do not want to participate and do not have any part in what we're doing. We don't want to harm those that didn't participate in our decisions. So what does it really mean? It means that my vision of the future is a rather complex and far out there one. And a lot of people might be thinking, okay, this is, stupid blabbering of somebody who read too much political theory. What does it have to do with technology really? Well, the thing is that all these things happen by accident already. We have right now three big counter movements to what technology is doing to us. We have the so-called crypto wars, which is the European Union, the Five Eyes states, several others, India, that are trying to rein in encryption so they can stay in control of communication that is happening worldwide. Then we have the balkanization and re-territorialization of information. We have that in China, of course, with the Great Firewall of China. But the EU is proposing the same thing right now. And lastly, we have a new intermediation of peer-to-peer transactions. In the past, you would be able to just meet somebody over the fence and exchange cash or exchange goods. But what we're doing right now is we're putting a lot of these interactions on platforms that we don't actually control. And be it the war against cash, if you want to call it like this, or be it that our social interactions are moving more and more to platforms that are outside of control and outside of the control of any state that we might have legitimized. But that is not all. There's one more step coming. Another thing that we can see right now is the creation of what I call secret mega societies. It's a funny term, but what I'm talking about is that we have more and more groups in society that organize on the internet to create social change and that are completely disconnected from reality. And they're battling over the control of the systems that we depend on. And that might be police, right-wing, meeting on Telegram channels, or that might be some hacker groups somewhere, or if you want to believe in that, some Russian spies. We also have the growing of borderless institutions, and a good example for that is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not as institution in the classical sense that it's run by people primarily, and that we primarily interact through people with it. But it is a social institution in the sense that it is a transaction system, that it is something like money. And around social institutions, society developed. And societies are known for coming into conflict with each other. And the last thing is that with our developments in cyber-physical systems, we see a new phase of war. And if you look at the news for the last few months, if you look at the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, we already see that cyber-physical systems in the form of drones are dominating our battlefields. And the problem is that these tools are reaching more and more people. They become available to anybody who wants that. And there are two terms in that field, that is super empowerment and omniviolence, because the cheaper weapons get and the more they allow us to take over societies, the more attractive it is to smaller organizations, non-state actors, etc. So we have this perfect combination of problems. It's the not learning from complexity science how to deal with complex systems. We don't know how to govern. We don't have good management technology. We're still thinking about the world as if it's the 1900s. And at the same time, the future is already happening to us. And we better wake up and not just ignore it, but participating in shaping the process of the future. So we have to overcome the constraints of our current governance systems and enter a digital age boldly, in the sense of rethinking what society and states and groups of people really are, and how we want to live with each other. Because we cannot be just consumers of technology. We have to be shapers of technology. So instead of having a vision of the future that is a description that maybe people think I should have talked about, I think that my vision of the future is a mode of thinking and a mode of questioning what we have and envisioning how we can do it differently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Smuggler, for this very interesting talk. I see there are many interesting questions already in the chat, so I want to start with these. And I think it's the obvious one, right? People say I think they like your vision, but they ask themselves, how can we start this? How would you get started with this? Is it a bottom-up approach? Methuselah asks, is it a bottom-up approach where individuals control the data? Mustn't it be introduced as law by some higher level governmental body? So how do we get started with making things simpler?
It has to start from the bottom up, because the institutions that we currently have already don't know how to deal with the world. They are not just behind, they really don't have the concepts. And doing it from the top down also introduces this issue that the path dependencies in that system are too far locked in. So if they make a mistake, we all suffer from it. So it must be a bottom-up approach. It must be something where we individually take control over our data and our actions and our social relationships. It starts with how you consume technology, what's the technology you select, and it starts also with how you think about that, because I think one of the worst ideas one can have about the future is to think that other people will be able to solve our problems for us. The future is really about us taking hold of it individually.
And there's another one that is quite similar to the first one, but I think it's an important thing. If you look at the structures of the state right now, it's quite powerful. There's surveillance everywhere. Then you have the big ones like Facebook, Google, and so on. So the structures are there already in place everywhere. How do we escape these structures? So when we go back to the first question, how do we get this started? How would you start?
I think that one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to believe the marketing of the states and the big platforms. They're a nice little club, but we really don't need them. It is us that gives us power. There's no such thing as power just existing by itself. It's something that we lend to institutions. It's something that we lend to people. The first option to act there is to take control of your social interactions, to not outsource them, to learn how to deal with your neighbors face to face and not through Twitter. It also means that instead of just relying on some promises in some terms of services, you can use encryption technology, for example, yourself. And encryption technology is already dramatically efficient and effective. So it is demonstratively a tool with which we take power back into our own hands, because mathematics is on our side there. And we are already able to, for example, make payments with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. We're also able to have new identity systems. We are already able to communicate privately. All these things are already possible, and they just have to be done.
99%, this is another question, of the society don't care about privacy. There can only be really be a movement with, there cannot really be a movement with 1%. Or can it?
Fascinatingly, a lot of social movements in the past are actually minority movements. There are a few percent of a population that actually change world history. It's usually not 90% of the people that go, but it's a few percent. So that is number one. Number two is we have to rethink about what it actually means to be part of the majority or not, because it's a basically industrial society thinking, where it really matters that everything is scale, and we have these super deep processes of work organization that force us into this thinking that we have to be part of a large group. We don't have to. Actually, technology is giving us so much more options to be effective and efficient in very small groups and to live our own lives. And I think that we don't have to convince any majority or wait for them. Quite the contrary, it's something that individuals can start, and it's something that might take a generation, but it is dramatically important for our future that we learn how to think in smaller numbers and with less complexity of societies.
So if you look at the realm of private societies now, there's major Telegram groups that are basically very separate and doing things on their own. And there are other channels that might be not surveyed by anyone. But how do you think this plays out in the long run? What's the next step for these groups? I mean, what kind of technology do you see coming next?
Well, the problem with these groups is that I think that a lot of these groups are not people that are in the business of making the world better. And that is a problem that I see with a lot of them, especially in the Telegram realm and social media and hidden media. And what we see a lot there is accelerationist thought that is not about building a better world, but by destroying everything they don't like. So when it comes to technology for the good people, let's say that, is all the technology is already there. So we are not really waiting for a technological revolution or something. We already have private anonymous messaging. We have relatively secure computers. We have digital cash. We have digital identity. All these things already exist. The question is if it's only nerds using them or if it is something that normal people are going to use. And so most of the changes I see in the future is that we develop new interfaces that are more accessible to normal people on the one hand. On the other hand, it is really about trying these things out and incorporating them into our social interactions. So instead of using WhatsApp, we might use Signal or conversations or something like that. And also, we learn how to actually have meaningful relationships and active relationships while using those tools.
I want to go back to the start of the chat here because there's a quite provocative question for you, maybe. Why is it a problem that we give up privacy and data sovereignty? Maybe we need to overcome the bumpy path now and then become Borg-like states, like individual, less complex, more society-focused creatures.
I think that there's a categorical difference between ants and humans. And the difference is that humans adapt by reason and ants by genes, which makes thinking in genes as a hive, as a swarm, much more efficient when that is enough, if you have the time for it. Humans as technological creators adapt by thought, by reason. And reason is something that only really works well if it is part of a conversation and a competition. Because there's no such thing as a magical tool that gives us truth and the best option that we should choose. So the perfect way actually to kill humanity is to reduce ourselves to a hive mind. Because in that moment, we lose our biggest strength, and that is the ability to use reason efficiently.
I want to ask a bigger question again. And you talked about the cyber wars that are going on right now. So if I look at the decentralization space right now, I see you guys, the cypherpunks and the cryptoanarchists building parallel structures and doing anonymous stuff like with coins like Monero and all these coins that there are. Then you have the elephant in the room. You talked about this, Bitcoin, the biggest brand and the mothership, so to speak. And then you have thousands of shit coins with different use cases and everybody tells you this is the next hype. And then you have the big companies like Facebook. They try to introduce their own digital currencies. And then you have the nation states, which also try to introduce digital currencies. So if you extrapolate the trends that you see right now, how do you see this play out in the long run?
I think that we have exactly those three main domains in which not necessarily a real conflict, but more like a competition is happening, and that is nation-state coins, the so-called digital central bank money systems. Then we have company introduced coins, and it's a problem to think about that as introduced by single companies, because the only real contenders in that field are introduced by syndicates of companies. That was the same idea behind Libra, and if you look to China, WeChat, if you look to Japan, the movement there is more to act as a syndicate. And on the, I'm not even sure if that's the right term, but in the cryptocurrency scene itself, Bitcoin has won when it comes to the actual monetary demand, because it's the most conservative system. And everything else is technological experimentation, and is mostly not for investors, in my opinion, but for people that are interested in actually developing technology and seeing what is possible there. But I think that the future will be more niche currencies. There will be a lot of second layer systems coming on top of Bitcoin, but it's the elephant that is not going to go away soon. So Bitcoin is there to stay, and all the future conflicts in the whole field will be between those three groups. It will be between Bitcoin and everything that is put on top of that. It will be the central banks, and it will be syndicate introduced technologies. And if they can coexist or not depends dramatically on the question of how well nation states are able to coordinate on their rule enforcement. And that might not work at all, or it might work too well. It's going to be a precedent for a lot of technological regulation in the future.
So maybe I think there's one question after that, but the last one, you talked a lot about the states of crisis, basically, that we have right now. I think there's a lot to see right now. We have the polarization between different political groups. We have the crypto wars, as you said. We have wars in the air, so to speak. What are you looking forward to in the future?
The same thing I'm looking forward to every single day. I'm not somebody who's depending on how the far future looks. You know, I'm not waking up in the morning and saying, "Oh no, I'm missing this big thing," or "I'm afraid of this big thing." I think that every day is interesting enough, and we have so many interesting things that we can deal with now, that we can experiment with, that we can change, that we can, and so on and so on. All our options are today. They're not in 50 years. They're not in 10 years. They're today. And if you embrace the world as it is today, you will realize that it's a playground, basically. It might be a little bit dangerous, but it's also interesting and has enormous opportunity. So I'm not really looking forward to anything but the next morning.
That's nice. And there's Pino asking one last question. Any literature suggestions that you have?
Yes. So there's this problem with a lot of edgy thought that it is in the realm of science fiction. So I have to talk about that. Werner Winch, True Names, Charles Stross, Halting State. I would probably suggest most of Neil Stephenson's books and most of William Gibson's books, just for the general overview of the aesthetics and the thoughts. Then a really important book is Kryptoanarchy and Private Utopias, if you can find that. It's sadly not that trivial to get. And all of the other stuff is really available on the internet. So look for Kryptoanarchy, look for opaque.link. There are a lot of writings out there by very different people. So yeah.
Thank you. There's one comment in the end. I want to read this to you. Oh, it's gone. It was there for a sec. You like Jesus and Buddha and something like Smuggler. I don't know.
I hope not.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and I think it makes a perfect end to this day.